One is the problem of international relations in which an established power, the United States, is dealing with a rising power of China. And there is an experience from an ancient Greek historian, Thucydides, who said that the reason why Athens and Sparta fought is that Athens was a rising power, Sparta was the established power, and they couldn't work it out. And more recently, Graham Allison at Harvard looked at the last 500 years for all the cases in which a established power was dealing with a rising power. And he found 16 of them, and 12 of them led to war. That's not a good odds. And yes?
Who won?
Who won which one?
Of the rising powers and those established powers. I'm just curious.
He didn't calculate that way. I'm not sure. If you would, you would say, for example, World War I and World War II, the rising powers in both cases was Germany, and we know which one they lost. But not always, of course. Now, one of the ways of dealing with this is to try to develop norms and rules of the road for understanding what's proper behavior. And I'm working with a Chinese delegation, an American delegation that's meeting regularly, especially on the context of the question of cyber conflict, where if cyber weapons were used on a large scale, it looks unstable in the way that nuclear weapons are not unstable. And so we're dealing with how to develop norms for understanding cyber tools, cyber weapons. So that's one area of important need for cooperation. Another is that you're all very familiar with is the decline of democratic norms, not only in the United States, but in many other countries, especially in Europe, where the basis for societal cooperation in the sense of governance are deteriorating. A third area is climate change, where one could certainly look at this as a technical problem, and I hope technical progress can be made. But it's also a collective action problem of getting large numbers of actors to work together. And then there's now I'll turn it directly to interdisciplinarity, because that's another area where cooperation is needed and is not trivial to attain. The research on what makes interdisciplinarity succeed when it does and what are its characteristics has exploded in the last 10 years, in part because of the ability to do large-scale analysis of things like citations and see whether people who publish articles together from different disciplines are more successful in, say, achieving citations. And there's a few things that are known. One is that interdisciplinary research is higher variance. It's not a higher average success, but it's higher variance, and so sometimes it really does very well, and many times it does not so well. And so it's not necessarily that interdisciplinary work is going to be, that more of it is better. I think if we could understand better the barriers to make it work, we could maybe change that. Another finding is about preferential attachment. This one's almost trivial, but the idea is that if you work with somebody, you're likely to work with them again. And maybe other people, and maybe in second order, that maybe you work with people that worked with them again. It's not too exciting. Another result is that you can map the disciplines in 2 dimensions such that distance represents the probability of collaboration, so that you have a lot more collaboration between, let's say, physics and chemistry than you would between physics and sociology. That's not surprising, and I think the maps that it gets you look plausible and reasonably stable. But that's not a lot of knowledge about interdisciplinarity. The questions that I've been interested in more recently are about collaboration and what can make it work and succeed, and also about the evolution of disciplines themselves. So on collaboration, the part of it that is well understood is that if a team has a diversity of tools and backgrounds available to them, they come from different cultures, they come from different knowledge sets, then that allows them to search a space and come up with solutions more effectively. So diversity is very good for teamwork. But the problem is that there's clearly barriers to people from diverse backgrounds working together and making something out of it. And that part of it is not understood very well. The way people usually talk about it is that they have to learn each other's language and each other's terminology. So if you talk to somebody from a different field, they're likely to use a different word for the same concept. That also comes up with Americans talking to Chinese about military things. But that seems to me just part of it. And another part of it is whether they have common goals. For example, if there's two different disciplines, the researchers might want to publish in journals from their own discipline so that their own peer group will recognize the contribution. And that could be a conflict of interest between them that they need to work out. The other problem is that what they come up with in a collaborative interdisciplinary activity may not be recognized as a contribution by any field. And this is especially true when there's new fields. So, and one of the things, though, that does make, at least the interdisciplinary activities that I've been involved with, I've asked myself what makes some of those work, and one of them is having some tools in common, for example, game theory. So game theory is understood as valuable and taught in much of the social science, but also in the biological sciences. And so being able to collaborate with someone who knows game theory and I know game theory gives us a chance to make progress, bringing together the things that one or the other of us doesn't know. So Ian mentioned civil war in the body as an interesting aspect. I saw an agent-based simulation. I assume most people know what agent-based simulation means? Okay. Of a growing cancer. And the agents were the cells. And I asked the computer scientist that developed that with a student, what are the premises that go into that simulation, what are the mechanisms? They pointed me to an article on the hallmarks of cancer. And it turns out that there are about 8 different defenses that the human body has to keep cells in line from becoming selfish and asking for more resources than is good for the host. And the common understanding was that a single cell line develops the mutations necessary to overcome each of those defenses. But when I saw the simulation and read about the mechanisms, I realized that that wasn't necessary, that it could be, and let me give you the analogy, if you have 2 thieves robbing a house, and one of them knows how to turn off the alarm, and the other one knows how to pick the lock, they don't both have to know how to overcome the defenses, as long as they're traveling together. And so in cancer, some of the defenses are overcome by putting out a certain chemical saying, build a capillary in my direction, basically asking for more blood and more oxygen. But another cell nearby might be exceeding its normal capacity to do something which would overcome another defense. And so as long as they're together, you don't need both a single cell line. And so that would help give you another channel for therapy, possibly, which would be to interrupt this cooperation among the cell line. So I went to a geneticist and then later an oncologist, and we worked out some of the implications of this. And first of all, to find that it hadn't actually ever been explicitly stated, and secondly, it was biologically plausible. So we we wrote this up. So here was a collaboration between a political scientist, an oncologist, and a geneticist. When we proposed this speculation about how things might be, we got 2 reviews. One of them said what we were proposing was impossible. And the other one said what we were proposing everybody knows. Anybody ever had a pair of reviews as challenging as that? Well, obviously we didn't explain ourselves very well, so we picked ourselves off the floor, rewrote it, and tried to explain why it's neither impossible nor the same thing that people know. So what provided I'm sorry?
It's a common situation.
Yeah. So what provided the basis for the collaboration is that one of us, me, was looking at this from sort of a social science perspective of a community action and cooperation, and the others had the competence about how cancer works. And so it was working on a known problem. A known problem is, how does civil war in your body get controlled, and how does it lose control? And I think one of the opportunities for success is if there's already a known problem, and then you provide another way of attacking it or making progress on it. As long as the problem is accepted in at least one discipline, then it seems to me you could use any tools and any new concepts as long as you can make progress in the terms that the people that care about that problem understand. If it's a problem that they don't realize they have, it's much harder. Let me talk about the evolution of disciplines, which is one way to think about this, because one way to approach disciplines is to see them as like an ethnic group or a language group where the people within a discipline are able to talk to each other very well, relatively well. And that's part because the disciplines have become institutionalized, so that anybody that calls themselves an economist or a geneticist knows a whole bunch of stuff that almost every other economist and every other geneticist in these 2 cases would know. And so they can talk to each other in the areas that the discipline has defined as building on their canon, in effect. And that's fine, but it's sort of like a gravity model in the sense that then the disciplines become more and more coherent over time, and that makes it easier. Then there's a body of concepts and terminology and science and previous experiments and so on that are shared, and that makes that kind of collaboration easier. But there's another group over here that has coalesced in a different place in this high-dimensional space. And as they each coalesce, they become further apart. There's fewer people in between. And another analogy might be like Spanish, French, and German. There used to be a whole series of dialects that are more or less continuous across that space. And eventually, those 3 countries established the canonical way of saying German, French, and Spanish, and taught it in the schools, which was very useful in the Industrial Revolution when you want people from a distance to be able to deal with each other. And then it wiped out most of the stuff in between, such as, with, say, Catalonia being a surviving exception. And in disciplines, we've converged, and the convergence is not just on subject matter, but it's incredibly well institutionalized, so that departments not only represent disciplines, like you have a physics department and an economics department, they control careers. They decide who to hire, and therefore professionals have a strong need to be attractive to at least one of those disciplines. Not only that, but they control the entry. They control the training process to say, what does it take in order to get a PhD in X or Y? They also control, to some extent, not as completely, the journals and the major professional conferences They don't control the small ones. Smaller journals are smaller conferences. So when a group like us gets together with different backgrounds and tries to communicate, a question arises. There's several questions about whether there's an emerging discipline of, say, brain intelligence and neuro and cognitive psychology. And because all those disciplines are so well established and institutionalized, it's not easy. So it's easier to get a center going, perhaps, but it's very hard to then get the established groups to say, we'll give you some tenure lines, we'll give you some faculty, we'll give you some resources and some course credits and the ability to grant the PhD under your duress, under your label. The way these things have coalesced is to some extent a frozen accident. Not completely an accident, because there really is a difference between what chemists study and what physics study in a matter of scale, for example. But in other fields, it's not as obvious where the boundaries would be if you started over again, or more to the point, where they should be now. And you can't erase the boundaries and just redraw them. Several places have tried that. Carnegie Mellon and Irvine are famous for having redrawn boundaries and tried it, and you could see that the problems they have include the fact that they can't develop a cascade of reorganization across the academic community. And so they are then at a disadvantage, let's say, on whether their PhDs are hireable, and whether the cluster of things that they teach in one of their department, one of their structures doesn't correspond to what anybody else does. The evolution of disciplines seems to be take several forms. One is the splitting off of a single discipline into several disciplines, or usually one. Like maybe astronomy is on the edge of being separated from physics in some places and not others. Psychology, clinical psychology, is quite different from most, say, developmental or cognitive psychology, but they're still holding together. Sometimes a new discipline can arise from the territory between, like biochemistry in some places is a new discipline. And I think that one of the constraints that help define this is how much can a PhD candidate learn in 5 years. They can learn a set of tools, concepts, experiments, and common things. And when a single discipline is in the situation that parts of what is being done takes 5 years to learn, and parts of what is being done takes a different set of 5 years, then it's pretty ripe for separating those things out and giving them different names, and then different and having fission. And that's certainly one way that happens. And another way, though, is more typical of this room, which is where people from many different disciplines are working on some problem area, like what is intelligence, how does the mind work, how can we accomplish more effective AI, and what would it mean to do that. And so we can gather together in this room and try to understand each other, which is certainly a significant task, which can be promoted by having repeated meetings of largely overlapping people. But it's hard to buck the established institutional frameworks. Caroline mentioned just before lunch the topic of immunology and how the immune system has a kind of intelligence. And let me give you another collaborative example of mine dealing with the immune system. So I had worked with evolutionary biologist Bill Hamilton on evolution of cooperation in biological systems. And but then he later, a couple of years later, came to me and he said he had a theory of the origin of sex. And the theory was that it's an adaptation to resist parasites. That seems very strange. And it goes like this. Parasites want to or have an incentive, biological selection pressure to look as much like you as they can. And if they look really like you, then your immune system will not identify them as non-self. So so you can imagine a high-dimensional space that is basically the antigens, in which you're located here, and the parasites can evolve to become more and more similar to that, and eventually perhaps get to the point where you don't recognize them as foreign. Now, they have an advantage because they can reproduce perhaps 100 or more times faster than you can. So they can outrace you as you run away from them. And when I mean you, I mean actually your progeny over generations. And so Bill Hamilton's idea was that here's what sex does for you. It says there's one adult here and one adult here. They're really quite different in their how they present themselves to their immune systems and to parasites. And if you could take some of the genes from this one and some of the genes from that one, you've made a huge jump in this high-dimensional space. You haven't just moved incrementally. Like if you had asexual reproduction, your children would be very much like you. But if it's sexual, then from the point of view of the antigens, you're really very different. And therefore, sex is an adaptation to resist parasites. So he said, now to test that, or to at least show that theoretically, kind of a proof of principle that that's plausible, because the problem it has to account for is that only half of the adults have offspring. This is a tremendous biological disadvantage. It could be up to 2 for 1. That's a lot to overcome, so there's got to be some really powerful things on the other side, and to show that at least that's plausible. He said he tried to model this as being explicit about the, let's say, 3 characteristics of your adult, and then if you have 3 others from the other adult, and you mix those, and then model that. But he couldn't do the math after about 3, and it doesn't work for 3. So I said that I had learned about the genetic algorithm from John Holland, where you can have long strings of chromosome simulation, like 70 is no sweat. And he said, that's just what I need. And so we did some simulations with chromosomes of length 70, and then that's enough to make the search problem hard and make sex valuable. So what we had then was the problem of why we have sex is a well-understood problem. I mean, it's well understood that that's a serious problem in Darwinian theory, because the 2 for 1 disadvantage is so great. And there's another explanation for why the sex is the answer, but this one looks pretty cool. And so this allowed me to take something from computer science search technique and adapt it for a simulation of a evolutionary biology technique.
Time-wise, right.
Okay, so let me conclude by saying 2 things. One quickly, which is we are now faced with the question of human-computer interactions, or human cognitive, intelligent AI systems. And that is a lot like disciplinarity. The humans have some set of concepts, and the artificial intelligence system will have another set of tools, concepts, ways of organizing the world and thinking. And how can we promote the effective collaboration of humans and intelligent systems? And then the other question is, how do you guys do, and what is your experience with effective collaboration across disciplines?
Thank you. I have a basic question. Has anybody made a giant wall chart of the evolution of disciplines over the last few hundred years?
The evolution of...
What's that?
I'm sorry, did they
Of
make
the evolution of disciplines over the last
disciplines.
few hundred years. I've never seen such a thing. I've seen bibliometrics pictures of blobs of things of, where is the physics, where is the neuroscience.
There's sort of snapshots of today.
Right. Has anybody made that evolution?
No, I've looked for that too. No. There is some histories of universities that have been around a long time, and you could say when University of Padua separated philosophy from law or something like that.
Yeah, right.
But I haven't seen it more generic, and that would be interesting to do. Let me give you okay, it's up there.
Let's see, Stephen, could you derive it? from all the data you've ingested.
No, I was wondering. That was the Web of Science, the Science Citation Index, is hard to get access to. There's now this open citation project where people are, journals are contributing their citation metadata. It started maybe 2 years ago or something now, and is gathering steam. But that data is mostly fairly recent data.
Erez Lieberman got all of Google Book data, and he did a surprisingly good job of deriving history.
Yes. It's a funny situation because in academia, people are typically, there isn't management of research in academia. In a company, there is management of research, and it's kind of interesting what the trade-offs are between managed research and unmanaged research.
The historians, like to see the pattern of disciplines as infinite proliferation, So the phrase Renaissance man is kind of invented in the 17th and 18th century to describe a lost nostalgic moment of wholeness, right? When you possessed all disciplines in one person. So it was already acknowledging that there were divisions happening.
What do you see the main difference?
I'll tell you, for my company, and I can't say this very scientifically, but over 30-something years, we've sort of developed the concept that we're going to put together these teams of people, and the people will have different expertise, and they will work together. There were, in earlier times, that was actually hard to achieve, but we finally got to the point where people culturally expected that, people from different backgrounds would put together in teams. Now, I don't know whether that happens in universities as effectively.
Well,
it's something that took a long time to achieve for us.
How about in this series of conferences? Have we gotten to talk to each other and understand each other?
I don't remember who it was who said the best interdisciplinary conversations take place inside one person's head.
I attended a university in which the Vice-Chancellor's project in the early 60s, days of great optimism in Great Britain, was to redraw the map of learning. And interestingly enough, every student of the humanities was required to read 3 books. One was Turner's thesis on the expansion of the American West. One is Jacob Burckhardt's Civilization of the Renaissance, and the other was Tawney's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, on the understanding that you could not approach the humanities without a background in historiography, the nature of history, and the changing ways in which history is studied. And that whole project lasted about 15 years and then was swept away. When I go back to my old university, there's the history department, the English department, a kind of inertia dragged it back.
I think the answer that you already gave the answer to your question, which is that, or Hamilton did, in the sense that this beautiful explanation for the origins of sex, which is the same reason you should have these interdisciplinary things, because it allows you to outrun the parasites who build up in the history of the world. Exactly. Change.
That's right. Sex is the ultimate interdisciplinary act.
There's also the internal problem of errors in replication that accumulate without hybridization, right? So self-replication without hybridization risks a lot of errors and repetition of errors and accumulation of errors.
Maybe I could ask a question about disciplines and their evolution, because you see a discipline in its first generation. The people who founded the discipline are still around. They still know what the fundamental questions are. They're still often a bit insecure about the foundational things that the discipline is based on. And then you get to more generations, and by the time you're at third generation of people, they never even discuss typically they don't even discuss the foundations. It's just assumed. My question would be, if you look at the period of maximum fertility, maximum lasting effect of a discipline, is it the case that most of it is it in the first 10 years? Is it in the first 25 years? Is it in the first generation? Which generation? I mean, should disciplines be euthanized after they've gone through 5 generations, for example? Because they basically won't produce significant output by the time they've gone through 5 generations of people.
I doubt that. It seems to me that's a little like saying, should we get rid of some culture because it's been around a long time and it's worked as much out as it can? That seems silly.
Well, that's an extreme version, but my question is, at what point in the curve? It's like, You know, it's true with conferences, for
Well,
example.
one thing is that the paradigms can get mature and stale, but disciplines are richer than can change paradigms, as Kuhn says, and that's a possible form of regrowth. Let me give you an interesting example of biology where the disciplines of biology have been now reorganized to turn 90 degrees. It goes like this. It used to be botany and zoology, right? Plants and animals. And now it's skin in and skin out. So skin out is ecology and evolution. Skin in is like microbiology. And so they just turn the whole thing sideways. And so that's a case where and it still is, I think, more fluidity in in the structure of biological disciplines there are in any place else. Maybe that's because there's more things being discovered faster.
I think
But also, let me just say another thing about the disciplines are often tool-based. You get microscopes, you get microbiology. You can't have, and as we get tools to deal with artificial intelligence, for example, then it gives us an ability to see psychology in new ways.
I think an analogous rotations happening in psychology where you have, neuroscience as one set of methods, which then includes social neuroscience and clinical neuroscience and so on, and then behavioral psychology is another set of methods that, and those things, as you were saying before, would have traditionally been clinical psychology and cognitive psychology, social psychology, and so on, but then getting rotated around into behavioral methods versus neuroscientific methods, where the questions that are being asked in those groups are now starting to be, I think, quite different.
The problem with a new discipline or new restructuring is the evaluation of performance, because the people in the new field will tend to say that anybody else in the new field is worth valuing, worth promoting, worth funding. And people outside don't necessarily can see that as kind of special pleading. And because it's a new discipline, it doesn't yet have well-established, for example, old journals hierarchies, so you can say that's the best journal in the field. And even if you could say the best journal in this new field, you can't necessarily say how that would rank among other things in a broader area. And that inability to do high quality and consensual evaluation outside of a discipline, outside of a new area, means that it's a comparative advantage for somebody not very good to go into the new area.
That's also because
And that in turn leads to a suspicion in people in the old area that the new area is attracting people that couldn't do successfully the old thing. Not that they weren't interested in it, or that they were pioneers in some sense, but maybe because they see they would thrive in some area where the evaluation is harder.
So sometimes what can happen to an old field is particularly one where the original founders of the field might not have been the nicest people in the world, is that they can get extremely grumpy. They refuse to cite each other. Who was telling us about an NSF panel where there are these 3 solid-state physicists on this NSF panel, and they recommend that none of the proposals be funded.
So I'm curious about, one thing I've noticed in the creation of new fields is you ask who are the people who come into a new field when it's created, right? So, for example, are they young people, are they old people? What's the type of person who comes into a new field when it's created? The thing I've noticed, things I've been involved in, I've been surprised that it's not just young people who come into a new field. And it seems to be the case that there are fields or paradigms that are suitable for particular individuals for one reason or another. And if they're lucky enough to live at a time in history when their paradigm is one that is, being pursued, then they gravitate to that and they start doing it. The thing I've noticed over, I don't know, now I've got data for maybe 25 years worth of data for different kinds of things, is that my anecdotal observation, I'm curious what other people have seen, is that if you look at the people who come into a new field when it's young, and then you wait 20 years or something, about half the people who came into the new field when it was young are still in that field, and half have gone on to do 3 new fields or something after that.
I think there's an interesting tension that comes up with what Tom was saying about when fields bifurcate in terms of methodology or when they bifurcate in terms of content. So in some ways, the methodological differences make it harder to communicate because the tools are different. But on the other hand, my experience has been that when you actually had successful interdisciplinary cases was when you could get people using different methods who were trying to answer the same question. And maybe sometimes having a question that's even narrower than the kind of question you'd typically think of as being a domain question. So, not how are we going to solve the problem of the mind, but how are we going to, my example is how are we going to figure out how causal inference works? That's a nice example of something that we actually succeeded in getting real interdisciplinary, where we actually succeeded in getting real interdisciplinary work. Or how are we going to figure out how people figure out what's going on in other people's minds, and what came to be called theory of mind. That really promoted genuine interdisciplinary work, and that was because you had people with different methods who were trying to solve the same problem. So there's a tension where I think that's much more likely to work than, in fact, I can't even think of examples where what would happen is that you'd get a bunch of people together because they said, oh, well, we're all using the same methods, and we want to find out more about the common methods, even though we're solving different problems, maybe.
That's
imaging?
most scientific conferences.
Do you think,
People tried collaboration across disciplines and it didn't work, and why?
Well, I've done a great, like you, I've done a lot of interdisciplinary work and effectively invading a number of fields, and some fields very much don't like being invaded, and but they also at the same time they're flattered that somebody's paying attention to them. For instance, this field of quantum mechanics and photosynthesis, which I and some friends from the quantum information community realized that we could actually make some reasonable contributions to this field starting about 10 years ago. And this is a small field full of grumpy old men, they're all men, who never cite each other's work. It's like the maxim that science proceeds one death at a time. Well, at one of the conferences I said, these people in this field, I've never met a field so closed in, you can only make progress in your own specialty by dying yourself. Which the graduate students thought was very funny, but the professors didn't think it was very funny.
Your problem of how does photosynthesis work was obviously accepted as an important, photosynthesis is obviously accepted as an important thing, not an obscure thing. And how it works was understood it was already understood that they didn't have a complete satisfactory account. And therefore, if you could provide a better account, then they could appreciate that that's a contribution no matter what tools you use to get there.
But he's saying it was cranky and they didn't accept it.
No, they did. No, it ended up being accepted because
So
they did need to learn about it, and they didn't understand what was going on with quantum coherence, and the methods that we supplied did allow them to figure that out. But boy, did they were dragged kicking and screaming to this, and would never still don't want to cite the books and things like that. So,
you mentioned that you've gone back to science rather than writing this book you were talking about. So what is your science? How would you define advances in the science? Because I don't quite understand what the field is, basically.
Well, I guess I'd put it two ways. One is my field is international relations, and especially great power relations, and especially issues of war and peace. Okay, so that's the core of my career interests. And but the other side of it, another direction, is I'm a math modeler. And I'm looking for opportunities to do math modeling, and in particular, what I tend to like is agent-based modeling, and Santa Fe Institute kind of complexity work. And I'm an opportunist, and I'm a curious person. So if I see a model of simulation of cancer, I say, how does that work? I make a real effort to meet people and talk to them, often over lunch and sometimes at meetings. As all of you guys are, since you're here. And so my field could be something different. I mean, I haven't done anything specialized in artificial intelligence, but I'm fascinated by it, and I could see, for example, that as a social scientist, what I could see is that if you take autonomous vehicles, which are our best example currently of sophisticated artificial machines that are being built and problematic, that while one approach and a common approach is a technical one, can you make them more and more sophisticated and more able to understand its environment and avoid mistakes, but a whole other approach is that what's going to hold it up is legal liability questions, not the technical quality questions. It's already 10 times better than humans. The problem is who's going to take responsibility for the accidents, and how do we institutionalize that judgment, right? So that between the insurance companies, between the manufacturers, between the owner of the car, between the person that sets the parameters.
Last question?
I would ask, would you recommend to a junior faculty member in your department or in a biology department to pursue interdisciplinary work?
Certainly there's
Yes or no?
I have a related question, which is there are fields that privilege single author and fields that privilege multiple authors. And I think the answer would be different based on these two models.
One thing I certainly would say is that in order to get tenure, the tenure committee wants to know how good a bet you are in the long run. And let's say all of your work is done with a senior person, the same one senior person. Well, that's not a way to build up a record that then could be evaluated. So if you're going to do collaborative work, two things you should do. One is collaborate with different people so that they could say that the intersection of that kind of stuff was probably you, or to have a certain character, like you're the one that brought differential equations to the sociologist or whatever. So there's something distinctive. And the other is to make sure that your single-authored work is among your best work. Because if it's not, then they're going to say, well, if that's your average quality, then that's going to attribute that to all the collaborative work. So work with different people and make sure that your single-authored stuff is among your best.
Thank you, Bob.